Hello to all of the real progressives out there. Thank you so much for tuning in today. Start with Real Progressives plugs as usual. You guys know the drill. If you want to learn more about us or support our organization, find any of our content, articles, podcasts, etc., go to realprogressives.org. You can also find our Patreon there if you'd like to contribute to our organization. Every little bit helps, you guys. We very much appreciate the help. We're engaged in media, education, activism, organizing, all this kind of stuff. So please go to our website if you want to contribute or learn more about us. I would like to now show an interview that I did earlier this week. This is with Birrion Sondahl. He's an activist and writer with Real Progressives. He has a number of fantastic editorials on our website. Go to realprogressives.org if you want to find Birrion's work. This is us discussing the latest piece that he co-authored with our founder and CEO, Steve Grumbine. So it's about, truth versus unity and how disruption can be a good thing for movements and things of that nature. So this was a really fantastic interview with Birrion. Encourage you all to follow his work. Enjoy. I am very happy to be here with Birrion Sondahl. He is a writer and activist with Real Progressives. Birrion, thank you so much for taking the time.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So we're going to talk a little bit today about an article that you wrote with our founder and CEO, Steve Grumbine. I was hoping to read a little bit from the start of this, and then we can dive into the substance of it. It's for those viewers at home, please go to realprogressives.org if you want to find our articles and podcasts and all sorts of great content. This is titled Anti-Intellectualism and the Death of the Movement. You guys start with a quote here from Eugene Debs. All explorers, pathfinders in religion, morals, science, government, geography, in any and every department of human affairs are agitators. They are seldom or never popular in the beginning of their labors. Their fate, as a rule, is to suffer derision, contumely, neglect, and poverty, often penalties still more severe, and the exception only vindicates the rule. Can you talk a little bit about what that represents and how you see it playing out in today's politics?
Yeah, so I kind of see Eugene Debs as, he's a big figure in the socialist movement in the United States. And this was from an article of his on agitation. And essentially he is arguing that, without agitators, nothing is going to change. We're going to be stuck with the status quo. And that's kind of what we see today is, unless people are willing to get out there and make the changes that are necessary and speak power, truth to power, then we're just going to be stuck going on this same path, the status quo, which is what kind of Joe Biden and the establishment Democrats and Republicans represent.
And can you tie this in a little bit with MMT in maybe a broader sense and how the establishment responds to criticism of the almost dogmatic views about the monetary system that we see as sort of the mainstream perception?
Yeah, we're seeing this kind of, austerity politics really from a lot of the establishment. I guess right now the villain of the day is Joe Manchin, who is continually saying that he's not going to approve this $3.5 trillion spending bill. And, coming from a MMT standpoint, this $3.5 trillion is nothing compared to what we actually need to be spending. It's like we have the resources, we need to take direct action and spend far more than 3.5 trillion. But what we have these beltway politicians are saying, we have to raise taxes to pay for this, and we can't be raising taxes. It's like, we don't need to worry about the pay-fors right now. What we need to worry about is fixing the infrastructure and addressing climate change.
100%. Yeah. You guys also quoted later in the article here another Debs quote that I thought was great. The wranglers over creeds and dogmas are perhaps the most persistent of all agitators, the bedrock idea being that a wrong exists which must be found and exterminated. So to flip it to the other side, you were talking about the establishment there. How does this setup end up? How does this leave the people who are speaking about MMT perceived in a general sense?
And I guess they're being seen, as agitators, I would suppose would be the way I'd take that. MMT is not widely accepted. We see more the Paul Krugman School of Economics where they're not advocating large spending, want to make cuts rather than keep on spending on the people. So I guess, there's all these very dogmatic, stuck in the mud positions who refuse to acknowledge that MMT is correct about the way that the federal financing works.
And in your view, I mean, I've tried to maybe diagnose this a little bit in different ways, and I can see some of the dynamics that might lead people to think this way. I think some of it is a little bit natural, just because what money means to us is so fundamentally different than what it means to a currency issuing government. And there's also obviously the propaganda element. But what factors do you think lead to an environment where it is so misunderstood and misdiagnosed?
Yeah, I agree that propaganda element is a huge part of it. And then also just our entire education system is designed to mislead people about the fundamental truths of, not only MMT, but, things like socialism, Marxism, communism. Those things aren't actually taught in school. Rather, we're just taught that capitalism is the be all and the end all. And, ignoring MMT is another way to prop up the capitalist system. It's like, they're willing to spend these trillions of dollars on wars in Afghanistan that are going directly to private contractors. But when it comes to actually spending on something like, universal health care or a Green New Deal, suddenly, how are we going to pay for it comes up. And that's the question that we heard in the Bernie campaigns, like, how are we going to pay for it? But you never heard about it. Estimates of what we spent on the war on terror, I think, start at $14 trillion over the last 20 years. So.
Yeah, never a question about that, right? Never going to wonder where we're going to find that money for. Yeah, I think it's odd that there's this sort of preconceived notion that seems to be very universally accepted in our society, that like I'll hear people say all the time, and I really mean like well-meaning progressive-minded people will say things like, well, I'm socially progressive, but I'm fiscally conservative, as though it's like a virtue signal to say that, as though it's inherently going to bring on respect to say something like I'm fiscally conservative. Do you think we're making headways on those issues and getting people to look at this differently? How far behind in the game do you view us?
I think some progress has been made. I mean, you look at Congressman John Yarmouth. He's read the deficit myth, and he was willing to speak out about it. I think there's probably a few people in Congress. I know AOC has pushed some MMT angles before, as far as like the Green New Deal goes. So at least there's a few people who are willing to speak up on the matter, but for the most part, it seems like they're still stuck in this, taxed pay for spending. I know Joe Biden's been tweeting a lot about, we have to tax the rich to pay for this infrastructure bill, and that's not actually a helpful way to, look at this. It's like we have to tax the rich, but not to pay for anything.
Yeah. It's its own separate issue. We need to tax the rich for reasons that are like separate of the policies that we're talking about here. Did you see? I thought Stephanie Kelton's talk, her TED talk, quite recently. I believe it was in August. Was really fantastic. It was only maybe like 12 or 14 minutes long or something, but she really, I thought, got MMT across quite plainly. Do you see the mainstream coming around to that, or are you more hopeful that everyday people will begin to accept this and therefore sort of change the whole perception?
I think it needs to be a combination of the two, really. I think as everyday people learn about MMT, they're going to get angry, that the government's willing to spend on war, but not on basic necessities like healthcare, housing, food. So then there'll be pressure from the bottom for the people at the top to actually, change the thinking. And, even this minimal $3.5 trillion bill is progress of a sort. It's one of the biggest spending bills we've seen in a long time. So I guess that is it's progress. It's not what we need entirely, but it is progress.
Yeah, I've tried to cover that with nuance. It's certainly far from adequate, but I also hope it passes, and that's a weird thing for some people to kind of walk that line, you know. I'm curious what got you into MMT. I think for me, one of the things it sort of sparked my outrage, kind of like what you were just talking about. And I think Kelton sums this up with the quote that once the MMT coin drops, you realize the suffering is gratuitous. And I think once I realized, like, I used to think that it was incompetence on behalf of Congress that was leaving our country as it is. When you learn MMT, you really realize it's a choice, like a very explicit choice that legislators are making. And I'm just curious what sort of sparked your outrage in this regard. What got you into MMT and viewing the world from this perspective?
I think I learned about MMT during Bernie's first campaign. And Stephanie Kelton was his economic advisor, so I kind of looked into the whole thing then, and that's when I kind of started learning about it. And then at some point in there, started following Real Progressives and following Steve, and when Macro and Cheese came out, started listening to Macro and Cheese and learned a lot more about MMT through the podcast. So it's just kind of been a ongoing process since Bernie's first campaign.
Gotcha. Right on. Yeah. And quick plug for any of the viewers that have not watched Steve's podcast or listened to Steve's podcast, rather, Macro and Cheese drops on Saturdays. Fantastic work. He has all sorts of great guests on, covers all sorts of issues from that MMT lens. I wanted to read here just a couple paragraphs from the start of this article. Knowledge is power, yet it is reviled by much of the population. Unity is created, but at the cost of truth. This is as true on the left as it is on the right. Progress does not come through acquiescence to the status quo and continuing to live in a myth of federal deficits and taxpayer-funded spending. Agitation shakes up the status quo and is seen as divisive, but progress is not possible without agitation. Many in this movement have failed to learn from the mistakes of the past. From the 2016 campaign, where Hillary Clinton lied and mocked Bernie Sanders' attempts to provide for the common good, to the 2020 election, when a veritable army of primary challengers repeated neoliberal talking points, the media fed into these lies with the repeated question of how are you going to pay for it, a question which is designed to weaken enthusiasm for big systemic changes like a Green New Deal or Medicare for All. Bernie came up with a series of pay-fors that were unnecessary in a country with monetary sovereignty. So that brings a couple of questions up. I was hoping you could first just kind of distinguish the difference between divisiveness and agitation, because while they're perceived to be very, very much the same, I think there's an important distinction there. Can you kind of explain?
Yeah, I mean, like, you look at people who are looking to actually divide the movement, and that's where divisiveness comes in. Splitters, it's kind of a COINTELPRO sort of approach.
Yeah.
It's like you claim you're on their side. Like, I'd almost look at Elizabeth Warren as a splitter, a divisive. Her campaign was about divisiveness. When she starts calling Bernie a liar and sexist, it's like that was not uniting the progressives. That was actually splitting, trying to split the progressive vote in the primaries in order to make sure that Bernie couldn't win. Because as we know, Elizabeth Warren is a neoliberal, not actually a progressive, but she still was able to take a lot of votes from Bernie, and that's why she stayed in. So you look at, and then I'd actually look at Bernie as more of an agitator, because he was, especially in the 2016 campaign, he actually came out and said, Hillary Clinton is not qualified to be president. And, just look at her history. Here's why. She's giving these speeches to Wall Street. She's, owned by the donors. She's a hawk, all of this. And I wish he would have done more with Joe Biden. But, that was more of agitation because it united the people against the establishment. And it also shook things up. Because this is something, you don't hear that very often in a presidential debate where they say, oh, well, my opponent is actually unqualified to be president.
Yeah. Yeah. So it might be slightly reductionist to put it this way, but I like the way you just framed that with, I think the difference may be, or one of the differences may be, an agitator, the division that the agitator creates is between the people and the establishment, whereas the divisiveness, like someone who's divisive, is creating divides between people or between popular movements. And I think that's a really key distinction to make. on that Bernie, I've always been puzzled by Bernie in a sense. And you know, I volunteered for his campaign. I supported both of his campaigns. I knew Stephanie Kelton was his top economic advisor, so I knew he must understand MMT, or else he would have picked another economist, right? So I've always been confused by Bernie's framing of some of his policy issues, where while he doesn't go as far as a lot of establishment politicians do to buy into the tax to spend thing, he clearly would answer those questions in a tax to spend way. And I'm just curious, like, what are your thoughts on, do you think that's just an old dog isn't going to learn new tricks? Do you think he's playing to his audience? What's your view on why he's framing things that way?
I don't have any real insight into, Bernie's thinking. My only theory would be that he needed an answer that he could give in a 30-second, 60-second soundbite on a debate stage, and trying to explain MMT, which is something that maybe he doesn't even have that good of a grasp on, is something that he couldn't give in a 30 seconds when they give him a, how are you going to pay for it? So when he comes up with this like 4% payroll tax for Medicare for All, that's something that he can easily answer and defend on a debate stage, or he's on news shows or whatever. But that's,
yeah, I mean, politics is, you got to be able to put it on a bumper sticker kind of a thing. Unfortunately, I mean, it leaves people who take a deeper view on things in a place where it's harder to explain our positions. And the other one, you brought up Elizabeth Warren. I'm just curious, do you think like when she first hit the scene, she clearly was like the lefty of lefties in some regard, because she was fighting Biden on the bankruptcy bill, and she, came up with a lot of progressive rhetoric. Do you think she was always what she is now, or do you think she evolved? What's your, I'm obviously just asking your opinion. I know you don't have, any particular source on that, but what's your view on the evolution of Elizabeth Warren, or was it an evolution?
She's always been an opportunist. If you look at, like, deeper into her career, you can go back and see her giving speeches to the Federalist Society. So she was not left then. You look at her using her, story of Cherokee blood to be, Harvard's first female woman of color professor. She's always been willing to take advantage of what she can to advance her own interests. So, it's like fighting the bankruptcy bill. I think that gave a name for her. And I do think in some ways she's interested in what she considers to be like a more fair system of capitalism. But, she's also a market capitalist by her own admission, her own words. She always says, I'm a capitalist. Yeah. So I don't think she has a real understanding of the exploitation that's inherent in the capitalist system. So her idea was to uphold the capitalist system and make it a little bit more fair. Yeah, no, I think that's a fair analysis. I wanted to also ask you about, you guys brought up in this article, you brought up Fadl Kaboob's theory of like kind of a layer cake of policies, and how they really kind of have to build on each other. And I think we progressives often find ourselves in a position where when we're talking about one of our core policies, someone will find what they perceive as a gap in that policy, and we have to kind of answer it with, no, but we also want this, or we also want that, and it starts to kind of be difficult to message. Can you talk a little bit about how that layer cake applies to our policy proposals, and how we might effectively explain that to people? Yeah, I mean, that's one thing that was so great about Bernie's campaign, was that he brought these different policies to the forefront. Like, Medicare for All is great, but by itself, it's not enough. And then same with the Green New Deal. And I think the most important part about the Green New Deal, other than just addressing climate change in general, is that it included a federal jobs guarantee, which is a major, major position that we have to get behind, because this addresses unemployment, it addresses the minimum wage. So fight for 15 is old news. I'd much rather have a federal jobs guarantee that starts with a whatever the number might be. It could be 15, but I think now we need to look more at $20 to $25 an hour minimum wage. And if the federal government had a option to work for them with community-based labor. Communities get together and decide what they need in their community, and then the federal government pays for it. Then we wouldn't even need to address the minimum wage laws, because if you have someone who's looking for work, they could say, oh, here, my community needs cleanup in the park, when we're going to do it for $25 an hour. Okay, great. And this would force corporations to make concessions on minimum wages. So I think the federal jobs guarantee is something that's overlooked pretty often, and it was a key part of the Green New Deal.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think similarly to how you just described it, the minimum wage would no longer be required, because it would effectively, the floor would be set by the program. And that also applies to other elements of the workplace, right? Like if you fight for 15, I it's not that I don't support that. I want to raise the minimum wage too. But say we rose the minimum wage even to 20, like say we succeeded magically tomorrow in doing that. Employers could still treat their workers like shit. I mean, Amazon could still abuse their workers while they pay them 20 an hour. If you have a jobs guarantee, you're also raising the floor on the treatment of workers, because now the floor has been set here, and private sector has to match it. Can you just talk about how all-encompassing that policy actually would be in so many different regards?
Yeah, and it's interesting you bring up Amazon, because Bernie actually forced their hand into a $15 minimum wage, but then what they did was they cut benefits for their workers. I don't know all the details on that, but I assume it's stuff like healthcare plans and retirement plans. I know they cut a lot of the benefits, so they were able to get the headlines of, oh, we're offering $15 minimum wage, and then behind the scenes they were cutting out a lot of other expenses. So in reality, they were probably still benefiting from, still profiting off of exploiting labor in this case. But like a federal jobs guarantee, if you're working for your community, it's really what it does is it redefines what work is. And that's what people don't understand, is like, oh, they're going to force us into some kind of like unnecessary busy jobs. And like, that's not what it is. This isn't like a mandate to have you go out and do something that's absolutely unnecessary. This is rather communities getting together and saying, what do we need in our community? I like the example of, like, if someone's, street musician, they could get paid by the federal government to keep on being a street musician rather than busking and relying on donations from people. And we'd still have the benefit of having music in the subway or music in the park or on, street corners, whatever it might be. And this person would be doing what they want to do and still making a living. So.
And added benefit to that obviously is stimulating to the economy, because this person is now not dirt poor. Now they're able to maybe go get an apartment or participate in the economy, which then stimulates it elsewhere. And the last thing I really wanted to make sure that we discussed here is you mentioned in this article the race to the bottom, and this has been quite a sort of it's sparked some controversy, I suppose you could say, and I think that the topic of this article perhaps applies to some lefties who have taken a less than genuine critique of our position on race to the bottom. Can you just talk about where you think that sort of visceral response to our position comes from, and how it ties in with sort of the anti-intellectualism and the desire for unity over truth, I suppose, if that's maybe oversimplifying, but somewhat true.
Yeah, I mean, this has mainly come up with, state-run healthcare initiatives where they expect a state to be able to somehow fund a universal healthcare program on a, state-based level. And that's just something that's not going to be possible when we take into consideration the fact that states aren't currency issuers. And I think a lot of people like the idea. It's like, I want to be able to have universal health care, and we know Joe Biden's not going to give it to us. So it's great to be able to get behind a state-based effort, but I just see that as something that's designed to fail, because it's going to require raising taxes. And, capital flight is a real thing. There's plenty of evidence that, look at Amazon headquarters when they're shopping, all these states are trying to give them, bribes, essentially saying, oh, well, if you come to our state and you're going to bring in so many jobs, we'll give you all these tax breaks to bring your headquarters in here. And I think there's a little bit of pushback on that now, but it's still like, states
very much
are,
a phenomenon. Yes.
yeah.
I mean, I live in Washington State. We lost a lot of the Boeing production went to, I want to say North Carolina. It might be, I think it's North Carolina. And now with Amazon too. So it's, I mean, regardless of what you think about these businesses, you also can't just have bunches of people losing their jobs and having these jobs, moving around the country constantly. That's not a healthy state for anyone to exist within, and it leaves poor states out to dry effectively. I mean, it which hence the term race to the bottom. Yeah, I think it's an incredibly important topic to continue to cover. Birrion, can you tell people where they can find your work?
Yeah, you can. I have a Substack. It's birrion.substack.com, and then you can also, find my author page at Real Progressives.
Absolutely, yeah. And I've had Birrion's Twitter. It's just at Birrion. You got a simple one there for yourself on Twitter. Make sure that you're following him. He's putting out tons of fantastic content, you guys, and really want to encourage everybody to go to our website and find all sorts of great articles. Birrion, thank you so much for taking the time to be here today.
Yeah, thank you. Nice talking.
What a great segment. Really want to encourage everybody, as we just did at the end of that interview, go to realprogressives.org, find all sorts of great articles, and go to Birrion's Substack as well. He's always putting out great content, great pieces. So we have